All right, let's really start diving in here and get into the history of comics. And it's ancient history. So I had you watch a few of those videos from Scott McCloud, right? His TED Talk's excellent. If you have not watched that yet, go watch Scott McCloud's TED Talk, all about understanding comics. He wrote this book in 1993 called Understanding Comics. And this is a great, great dive into what comics as an art form really is. It's a very highfalutin version of it, and some may say a bit too highfalutin, even at the time. But up until that time, nothing had really existed that talked about comics as the art form or the way that it was, except for this one other book, Comics and Sequential Art by Will Eisner, the great Will Eisner. Okay, he created The Spirit. It's excellent. And just go look up The Spirit. Very famous for his title pages in The Spirit, the design layout, always incorporating the logo into the designs. It's amazing and some of the best stuff you'll ever see illustrated, just ever anywhere. But Will Eisner is obviously one of the greatest greats of all time when it comes to comics, and he created the basic breakdown and guide to how comics work, talking about and using his examples of things, explaining light storytelling like this and all that sort of stuff. In 1985, I believe, is when this book came out. So in 1985 was the first time people really started deconstructing comics, right? 1993 is the next time a young fellow attempts to do that, much later admitting, of course, that some things that he's trying to figure out are, of course, wrong at the time. And some people took great umbrage with certain parts of it. But it's like, yeah, well, you got to go along. You got to theorize. You got to move things. Don't let anything stop you, right? It's just a good lesson right there. And that's what he did. And later on, he goes on and on to create reinventing comics. Because as you see in that video, right after he invented this book, 1993, he gets a computer right toward the end, right? And starts imagining what it's going to be like now. Because computers in 1993 didn't do much, but he knew it was going to happen with them, and now we see where we all went with that, and how the digital comics revolution and everything happened, and the way we deal with everything that it is today when it comes to visual media. I tweeted this man the other day to see if I could get a response. I didn't hear back from him. Maybe I give him a nudge. To ask him, I realized upon rereading this great, great book, are memes comics? Yes, they are. They are, of course, comics. It's a visual medium. It's a way of communicating. It's words and pictures. Sometimes words and pictures separated. It's all about that. Sometimes pictures in a sequence, of course, making some of the best memes of all time. But whether it's one panel, sequential, go look up the vocabulary I posted that before. There are different versions of comics. Again, you can have one panel, and that's got the family circus in there, political narratives, political cartoons are in there. So comics has a broad definition. This man really tries to use a lot of different versions of coming up with a container for it, and does a great, great job, really does. So I was a little worried about rereading this book because the first chunk of it is a slog. It is a bit of it. But as I picked it up, it's not as much of a slog as I thought. It's not as bad. And now that I'm a bit older, I really can appreciate it and see what he was trying to prove, because I've been this guy as well. You're really defending something. You're really trying to prove something and really being very analytical. He's described as by other artists as like almost gifted in the amounts of analysis and description that he has. It's almost like a talent, the way he will describe or analyze something, all right? He's just got a knack for it, and it's true. So, because you watch that biography a little bit in the beginning of that TED Talk where you find out about it. Son of a rocket scientist, right? So he goes on to talk about comics, just starting again right here in his room. So what are comics? Blah, blah, blah. What's this and that? And he just starts as he's illustrating this book in comics form, explaining comics. And this panel is the one that really just explodes right to you right from the start. It really shows you what we're really trying to look into about how comics, how big this scope of comics really is, and how simple it really is in what it is trying to do, right? So right there shows you this great, expansive definition of comics just through the characters you're seeing in there, right? And he's going to try and break down why we read them in this certain way and where it all came from. Hence, again, putting it in a container, all right? So with that, he talks about how very much all different styles of entertainment, be it music or film or whatever, certainly can be used in this similar fashion. But comics kind of tries to sum it all up in one thing using only the one sense of visualization to sum up. Sound, sound effects, all that stuff. The measurement of time passing, right? Trying to show how lines can emit smell, things like that. And using all of that, just that one visual is how we convey all five senses. That's what comics are really about. He does a great job here doing what I was talking about a moment ago, where he's talking about sequential art. Maybe we can call it that. We've heard it called that before. And then he's in a crowd, like he's on stage, which is brilliant. A bunch of people, but what about this? But what about that? And that's what the crowd keeps doing. And I even laughed when it did say, someone does it to him on the next page, right? But what about this one? What about this? Yeah, you tell him, Bob. Like, you can see it's the crowd standing up, but what about, right? Because you know how people are long before the internet. Boy, I sure do love apples and oranges. But what about mangoes? How dare you? Right? That's a modern meme going around right now. Oh, I didn't say that. You're right. Okay, what about, but you didn't say pears. He said mango. Did you say pears? And now we're off the rails, right? No, he's trying to figure it out, and he's not trying to leave things out, but this is what everything is. I always think of things like I say it a lot. I think of things like sculpture, right? He's just, right now he's building a thing, right? He's building, oh, is it this? Is it this? Is this? He's really molding a shape and then scraping away to try and get, that's what this book is, to try and get some words on a card that sum up almost all of it, which honestly, not really possible. It's a very broad term. You know, it really is. It really is a very broad term, comics, and that's the point. And perhaps even ever changing as we move into more digital stuff. As I told you to go look at that the video the other day of the Google Doodle, and I wanted you to look at that slideshow, and hopefully you can still access it, because that is technically the most modern way someone has told a comic story. The way that little thing animated there were slides, right? There was some overlap. The way it transitioned, you still move next, right? But there was a little bit of animation. So it was fascinating to me to see that. That is the newest, in my opinion, like representation of like a comic from someone, Google, an artist making it, and how it was as far as like this visual form, as far as what he's talking about as this thing is a shape because of the printed medium. And that's why we have rectangles, and that's why those rectangles form a narrative of reading left to right and then continuing down here, and how that starts to come about via the printing press. But we're jumping ahead. We're technically far back, but not far back enough. Because that's what this all is, right? Comics. When did comics start? A lot of people like to say, and that's what this book's about. Oh, well, you know, it starts around here, right? It starts around the 1900s. You know, that's interesting, 1900s, and then all of a sudden, you know, soon there's some comic strips that are coming out and Popeye's around and all that. But he goes, it's a lot further back than that, and it's not as simple as just Egyptian hieroglyphics. He'll go into that, because not hieroglyphics do not count. Certain types do, because hieroglyphics are actually more of a written language than they are pictorial stories with words. So he goes all the way back to a thing called 1500s, talking about this epic story of pre-Columbian picture manuscript discovered by Cortez around 1519, Ocelot's Claw, right? A gigantic comic that is written on parchment, deerskin, I believe, folded out, 84 panels right there. And that's the thing, is that that's an old-time version of that, isn't it? But then let's go even further back, right? And he's at the year 1049 AD, the Mayans are doing certain things, right? Certain things that tell comics and sequence and story. What he discovers, and what he talks about in that video, but it's a discovery as time rolls on, is that, here's another example, is that it's the battle rages, right? Oh no, I'm sorry, that's one of the things. This is the Bayeux Tapestry, all right? So this is that. Another example of fine art from back in the day, right? And trying to like, oh, this is comics. But people didn't understand that this was a graphic narrative, because what people discover later is that some of these were, you read right to left. You read zigzag bottom to up, right? Just because we read left to right now and go, that doesn't mean everyone in history did that. So it took some people to find all the components of a famous piece, I believe. I'll jump ahead to that. What was that one? Where he finds all the components of the quite a different case for Max Ernest's surreal collage novelle, A Week of Kindness, right? These were all scattered throughout the ages, and until they were collected and put in an order, people were like, oh, this is a visual narrative, okay? So there are a few other examples in this book that he does speak about that really talk about through the ages how eventually he does in that video. Oh, then word balloons start to show up. Oh, little narration box starts to show up, and a hop, skip, and a jump, and then we are right at comic strips and what they seem to be right around the turn of the century of 1900, where you start to see some of those characters, some faces familiar to you, some not, but more familiar to me because I recognize the Yellow Kid, and I know some of these other characters, like, who's that? Oh, we got, well, obviously no Popeye. There's Crazy Cat, the Yellow Kid. You've got, what's this other one there? Oh, there he is, right? I believe his name is Little Nemo, and he resides in a fine, fine place called Slumberland. There it is. So I have these great books, all right, by one Winsor McCay, all right? These are volume 3 and 4, just because grab what you can, grab what you can. And Bookman's a fine resource for old-timey comic stuff. So the great thing about this and comic strips is what I'm going to show you now is this art form around this time. These people, these creators, all right, were well-to-do. It was not nothing to be a illustrator doing this sort of thing. All right, Winsor McCay, animation fans know this man for creating Gertie the Dinosaur, the first animated feature. It was based on a gamble, I believe, a bet. This is all from memory right now. I'll check my references and note myself on the bottom. I believe it was a wager that he could make this happen, make a film, make motion picture animation, and he did it over 1 year by himself, thousands and thousands of illustrations. I could be wrong. I'm going to find out. Let's see if I'm right. Let's see if I'm wrong. Fascinating. That goes on into what he was doing here with comic strips, and the comic strip page is Little Nemo in Slumberland. Little Nemo is fantastic. It's one of the greatest, most imaginative things that there is, and we wouldn't have some of the greatest things that we have today without it. So Little Nemo in Slumberland, let me find it. Just a beautiful picture, right? So here we go. This is fun. It'll remind you of Up. So something right there from the previous strip. You can see a hook coming into that window they're looking at, using the panel actually pretty cleverly, right? And that hook is scooping up that house as that house gets whipped up there. You can see the word balloons even having a little bit of fun, getting a little small there. And house goes off in the distance. The word balloons, not much room to breathe around the word balloons, okay? And the house goes flying all around, lands, crashes, explodes. The use of color is phenomenal. And then he wakes up. It was yet another dream for Little Nemo, okay? And these pages were not the comic strip of today that has been scaled down and scaled back, scaled down and scaled back, that we see what happens. Think of like special effects and how you see terrible special effects, right? Think of how much effort and energy and how much creative artists are in the 50s making music compared to made by a music studio or made by committee. You know, it's the difference between how things work and how things change over time. This is a time when the comics page was the page. These artists got this gigantic piece of newsprint that was probably, I think, 1, 2, maybe 4 times this size, right? Because this is probably a quarter of it. And it would fold, fold over, fold out. That's like a poster that you're getting. It's insane. And this was the highest point of newspaper distribution. I believe 70 million something for newspaper distribution. There's Little Nemo naked in a bathtub. And then there he is. And then all of a sudden he just starts dreaming. And all of a sudden critters and animals show up. He's using his imagination. It's a fun time there. All that fun stuff. And then what happens there at the end? Getting chased by a polar bear, naked, terrifying. Luckily, it was all a dream again. So there you have it. And you can see the theme of Little Nemo in Slumberland, where it's all this amazing, imaginative, fun environment, really creative, magic in the air. There's lots of extra magical characters jumping around that he makes friends, all this sort of thing. And he just goes on all these adventures, having a good time, as comics do, but very, very fantastical. So that was really fun about Little Nemo. And Little Nemo really reminds me of this anime Metropolis. So I don't know if you've ever seen this anime Metropolis, but if you got time, go check it out. I always recommend it, but it's very much this big world of very different characters and very brightly colored. and very imaginative. And that's what I think about when I discovered Little Nemo, which is actually probably after I'd seen Metropolis. Because, I wasn't going back into the 1900s when I was a teenager. Not yet. So, McCloud, like I say, at some point, he goes on to do reinventing comics, right? To keep going and figure out how things are today and moving forward. This came out in 2003. So by today, I mean about 20 years ago. And by that, I also mean past this, he hasn't produced another book except for this one, which came out just a couple years later, Making Comics. So this is a really good one that teaches you how to make comics. If you're going to find any book about making comics, I'm not the biggest fan of that Christopher Hart, but I'd go with this guy. Christopher Hart does good work, especially the cartooning, but sometimes Christopher Hart dabbles in areas that he doesn't quite master, and his anime is terrible. But he's a franchise. What you going to do? But making comics, if you're going to get it from somebody, get it from Scott McCloud, because this guy not only dissects and understands comics, he really, really cares, loves, and has a passion for the art form as a whole, and is going to tell you all the Easter eggs and little bits, little things that make comics and comic storytelling matter more. I should read his seminal work, I would call it, besides this, that's more of an actual comics called Zot. And another thing that he did is called The Sculptor. So I don't know what that one is quite about, but he certainly is. That's been a later thing that's, again, a fictional and actual comic book, nothing to do with dissecting art form. It's just like, all right, put your money where your mouth is. What's a comic that you make look like? Go. So pretty good. I would really recommend out of all of them, more than anything, just really this Bible of comics right here. And it's this. And then you get updated ideas on it, because I'm sure since then he's just done blogs, things like talks, interviews. There's one at Harvard I watched that was very good. And I bring up the point of when I was growing up, when I was talking about you guys are here at a good time. Remember that from a previous video? That is because when I'm growing up, going to school, remember I'm telling you, we're not doing too well. They're saying Marvel's going bankrupt. Oh man, tough time. There's one book that exists for comics and another book that exists for comics. And that's it. That's it, right? Unless you're following newsletters and things like that. You got magazines. Wizard magazine was a famous comic magazine that had a how to draw section. So 2 to 3 pages a month of how to draw comics. And then now, if you want, you'd be like, what is Jim Lee? How does he draw Batman? Let's go watch. And he's going to tell you every single thing he thinks about and talks about when he creates Batman, which is why all of you now are mastering things that teenagers in my time in the 90s couldn't even conceive of, because they only could get it from 3 pages a month here, following other magazines like Draw and trying to follow everything. Like, there was a very limited supply, whereas now you have a limitless supply. You can go read Little Nemo without having to pay for it. Go find it. It's around. Just go Google it. You can Google and find almost all of this stuff, and it's free and available. I have a huge library of comic stuff, which is nice. It comes in handy because one day you want to teach comics, right? And then, guess what? You have to teach them from your home so nobody gets to look at your cool books. So I'll try to slideshow some of this stuff. I do the thing where I'm holding it up as best as I can, but I've just got to more get this information along to you than make fun, lovely slideshows. So we'll see what I'm able to get done in post, and we'll see what I can include just from holding things up, but you get the gist. Again, a quick Google image search of anything I'm talking about will give you a better idea. Were those specific Little Nemo adventures? Just go look up any of them. That's the point. Did I pick any out that were specific? No. I just want you to see the art style. The Yellow Kid. Go look it up. There's a great YouTube channel for that, just called Comic Tropes. I'm going to cite this website and this YouTube channel a lot. I only discovered it about 5 months ago. And this guy's pretty new at it. His name's Chris, and he does a great job of going through certain things throughout the history of comics that were epic and things that there's a reason why you should understand why this is important. So he does a whole fine thing up in the 1900s. Talks about the Yellow Kid. Yellow Kid, very famous comic, probably the first comic strip-like cartoon character, I believe is what it's called. Or here's a factoid about him I'll put in post. Wow, isn't that fascinating? So that's some of what goes on next as we get back into understanding comics, as I've chased you right up to the printing press and the turn of the century. Right? We've gone with the Mayans. We've seen that pillar in that other video. We've seen as people use pictures and different graphics to talk about story lifetimes, and just figuring out how to read them is what people had to discover first. And that's important because that's how we get a modern language and the modern language of comics. Some of that language being used right now in the stuff we see all the time, like your airport safety guide, right? How do you save yourself in case of an emergency, right? There's all that stuff. And photo booths, right? Those photo booths, people instantly and sometimes automatically make comic strips out of themselves. But going back to 1940, this is the era in which superheroes get invented and really set the style and create that graphic language for this whole art form, okay? It really does. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? And if you say, oh, comics, that's just superheroes, right? No, of course not, you fool. That they are for everyone. Comics are to tell any story, any type. Even some of those popular comics in Japan, manga comics, are those basketball comics, right? There's some awesome one it's about a basketball team. So sports comics barely exist here in the United States. Sports comics, they've managed to do it and tell stories in a way that have captured an audience. Isn't that fascinating, right? A lot of it, the use of line and the way they use line and transition. And that's a big part of what Scott McCloud talks about and what comics are all about. Transition is one of the biggest things for comics to overcome / adapt / tell stories with and all that stuff. The way that they draw the Flash is a perfect example. How do you show a fast man, let alone the fastest man alive? And I'm going to constantly be bringing up examples of motion and look at this use of motion, look at this use of line, because comics are all about a relationship between picture and time. That's what we're talking about. Again, what is it all about? What is this in any comic? Picture, right? Time, the space in between these lines and where something happens. Even if it's just him going, and now I'm continuing my conversation, but I'm facing a different direction. That's a moment in time that's as quick as this or that. And yet, another panel can be 10,000 years later, or something as sudden as chapter 2, right? That's exactly right. So that is exactly what comics do. They can tell time between eons, and they can tell time between seconds, and it's all the same width of line, usually about 1/4 inch to about 1/2 inch. Interesting, right? So that's what Scott McCloud talks about in that TED Talk, which I don't think becomes as relevant, where he says, what if we move a panel as 1, 2, 3 panels, and then there's a 4th panel, but it's all the way on this side of the screen? Does this feel longer to you? Because it took you 1, 2, 3 to get there? I don't know, because eyesight's pretty quick, right? It does work in the visual language, where we think about letters and words as graphics, not as I wrote this. Think of them as graphics. And then what is the ... I forget what it's called right now, but the ... I'll put it here. Bing, the ... That is a visual thing that lets you know when suddenly ... it happened, right? That's a way that we recognize pause and tell time in language using that symbol. A comma, same thing. So he's trying to think of this negative space, if we can use that in a different way. Would a word that you read on a page, if I put, they lived happily ever after, does that feel like anything to you, or does that feel broken? It feels a bit broken to me. So I think we as communicators and the way we've learned just as we're developed in the way that we are and the way we communicate, I think we all understand this gap, this small gap, as time passes, and then we just fill it in with what we see, right? We just fill it in, and it doesn't matter. The bigger the gap doesn't infer the bigger passage of time, because I think that that's just how we, and that could just be, of this generation, visualize language and visualize pictorial storytelling. So going back to what he's talking about and how he uses an example, let's see if I find it here and if it's important or in this chapter, where he talks about icons, and we're going to get to that. Maybe we'll do that a little bit next as we go into his vocabulary comics. I did like a glossary of comics, I guess, was the first video. Let's go into chapter 2 in another video so that this video does not seem as daunting, because we're already at about 20-something minutes. So not too bad. Everyone's trying to figure it out, and so they should. Here's to the great debate. Boom! Let's figure it out.